I never imagined that 2 barks from my old Labrador would end with an entire upscale neighborhood sitting in the dark, sweating through the hottest week of the summer. But that's exactly what happened. Looking back now, I still laugh at how something so small turned into something nobody saw coming, especially the woman who believed she could bully everyone into getting her way. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 48 years old, and I've been an electrician for most of my adult life. I live in a little corner house just outside Mesa, Arizona, the kind of place people drive past without noticing because every house around it has been rebuilt into something bigger, shinier, and a whole lot more expensive. Mine wasn't. My grandfather bought this property back in the early 50s, long before luxury developments swallowed the orange groves that used to cover this valley. He always said, "Never sell land just because somebody richer wants it." At the time, I thought it sounded stubborn. Years later, I finally understood what he meant. My Labrador, Cooper, had been with me for nearly 11 years. He wasn't aggressive, didn't chase people, didn't bark at every squirrel like most dogs. Honestly, he was lazier than I was. Every morning at exactly 7:15, he'd wander onto the front porch, stretch like an old man climbing out of bed, bark twice at the mail truck rolling around the corner, then come back inside looking proud of himself. That little routine never bothered anyone, until Melissa Harding became president of our HOA. Melissa was one of those people who somehow carried an invisible spotlight wherever she went. She drove a pearl-white luxury SUV that always looked freshly detailed, wore expensive workout clothes even when she clearly wasn't headed to the gym, and carried a giant coffee cup like it was part of her personality. She also happened to be a corporate attorney, and she reminded everyone of that fact whenever she thought it might intimidate them. The first time she knocked on my door, she didn't even bother saying good morning. She stood there with one hand on her hip and the other holding a neatly laminated violation notice. "Your dog interrupted my meditation," she said without introducing herself. I blinked, looked past her at Cooper lying asleep behind me, then back at her. "My dog?" I asked. "He barked twice," she snapped. "Twice is all it takes to ruin 30 minutes of mindfulness." I almost laughed because I honestly thought she was joking. She wasn't. "You need to control your animal," she continued. "This community has standards." I looked around at my yard. The grass was trimmed. The fence was painted. There wasn't so much as a garden hose lying out of place. "He's a dog," I said calmly. "Dogs bark." Her face tightened like I'd insulted her personally. "Then perhaps this isn't the neighborhood for you." I wished her a nice day, closed the door, and figured that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The following afternoon, another notice appeared taped to my front window. Then another one. Then certified letters started showing up in my mailbox, threatening daily fines for noise violations, property appearance, and even failure to cooperate with community leadership. One letter actually claimed my peeling front porch paint lowered neighborhood property values. That one almost made me frame it, because the porch had looked exactly the same for 20 years without anyone caring. The funny thing was Melissa never seemed interested in fixing problems that actually mattered. Broken sprinklers near the entrance stayed broken for months. Streetlights flickered every other night. The community mailbox leaked whenever it rained. Somehow none of those things deserved emergency attention. But my old yellow house. That became her personal mission. A few neighbors quietly apologized whenever we crossed paths. One elderly couple even admitted they'd received warning letters for leaving Christmas lights up 2 days too long. Nobody challenged Melissa because nobody wanted to become her next project. I understood that fear, but I've spent too many years fixing electrical systems to be impressed by people who mistake confidence for authority. If something is wired wrong, you don't yell at it. You figure out where the circuit begins. One Saturday afternoon, I was cleaning shelves in my garage when I found my grandfather's old metal document box covered in dust. I almost put it back without opening it. Instead, I carried it onto my workbench, flipped the rusty latch, and started sorting through yellowed surveys, faded photographs, handwritten tax receipts, and folded maps that smelled like old paper and engine oil. Most of it was family history I'd seen before, but one brittle survey caught my attention because someone had circled the southeast corner of the property in red pencil. I spread it flat under the light and stared at words I hadn't noticed years earlier. Utility easement retained by property owner. I frowned. That didn't sound right. I grabbed another folder, then another, until I found an agreement dated decades later. My heartbeat slowed as I read every line twice. then a third time. Whoever built the luxury subdivision had negotiated temporary maintenance access many years ago, temporary being the important word. According to the documents sitting in front of me, that agreement had quietly expired the previous year, and nobody had ever renewed it. I leaned back in my chair, looked toward the kitchen where Cooper was snoring loud enough to shake the floor, and smiled for the first time all week because suddenly Melissa's endless letters didn't seem nearly as important anymore. What mattered was the aging electrical equipment sitting inside that easement, equipment I knew better than almost anyone else, and equipment that depended on regular maintenance if it was going to survive another Arizona summer. For the next couple of days, I didn't say a word to anyone. I went to work, came home, threw a tennis ball for Cooper in the backyard, and reread every document in that old metal box until I could practically recite the legal descriptions from memory. Then I drove down to the county records office with copies tucked under my arm, just to make sure I wasn't missing something. The clerk disappeared into the back for almost 20 minutes before returning with a stack of archived plats and easement records. "Looks like everything matches," he said with a shrug. "Doesn't happen often, but expired agreements stay expired unless somebody renews them." I thanked him, walked back to my truck, and sat there for several minutes with the air conditioner running. I wasn't excited. I wasn't looking for revenge. Honestly, I was disappointed. If Melissa had simply walked across the street like a normal neighbor and said, "Hey, could you help us work through this?" none of what followed would have happened. Instead, she'd spent weeks trying to bury me in threats over a dog that barked for all of 3 seconds every morning. That was when I decided I wasn't going to argue with her anymore. I was simply going to exercise the rights my grandfather had chosen to keep 70 years earlier. The following Monday, I hired a fencing contractor I knew from electrical jobs. He pulled into my driveway, looked at the survey, then looked across the street toward the landscaped entrance of the subdivision. "You're serious?" he asked. "Dead serious," I replied. We measured everything twice before setting the posts exactly along the easement boundary. By late afternoon, an 8-foot chain-link fence surrounded the equipment pad. The transformer itself remained untouched, exactly where it had always been, but now it sat inside a locked enclosure on property where access required permission from the owner. I installed reflective signs that read private utility easement. Authorized access only. There was nothing flashy about it, just facts. The next morning, I locked the gate with a commercial-grade padlock and mailed certified notices to both the HOA management company and the local utility provider explaining that the previous maintenance agreement had expired and that future access would require a new written agreement with the property owner. Every letter included copies of the recorded documents. No insults, no threats, just paperwork. Melissa arrived before noon. I watched her storm across my yard while I replaced an outdoor light fixture. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, pointing toward the fence. I climbed down from the ladder slowly. "Protecting private property. You cannot block utility equipment." "I didn't block it," I answered. "I secured my easement." She laughed, but there wasn't much confidence behind it anymore. "I'll have this removed before dinner." "Maybe," I said. "Bring the paperwork." She stood there waiting for me to argue. When I didn't, she spun around and marched back to her SUV, nearly dropping her coffee in the process. By that evening, 2 HOA board members were standing outside the fence taking pictures while speaking into their phones. The utility company sent a field supervisor the next morning. He introduced himself politely, examined the records I'd attached to the gate, and asked whether I would unlock it so he could inspect the transformer. "I'd be happy to," I told him, "as soon as we have a valid access agreement in place." He nodded in a way that surprised me. "I understand your position," he said quietly. "I'll pass this along to legal." That answer told me everything. He wasn't saying I was right, but he definitely wasn't saying I was wrong. Arizona settled into one of those brutal heat waves that make the air shimmer over the pavement. Every afternoon, temperatures climbed well above 110 degrees. Air conditioners across the subdivision ran nonstop. As an electrician, I knew exactly what that old transformer was dealing with. 40 years of service, endless demand, and deferred maintenance were never a good combination. Equipment like that doesn't usually fail all at once. First it gets louder, then it starts running hotter. Oil temperatures climb. Internal insulation weakens. Tiny problems become expensive ones. Every evening, while watering my front yard, I could hear the low electrical hum drifting across the street. Day after day, it grew slightly rougher, something only someone in my line of work would probably notice. My next-door neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, wandered over one evening carrying 2 bottles of iced tea. "Daniel," he said carefully, "people are saying you're trying to shut down the whole neighborhood." I laughed softly. "No, I'm trying to remind them that property rights don't disappear because somebody forms an HOA." He looked toward Melissa's house and shook his head. "She's telling everyone you're dangerous." "Maybe," I replied. "Or maybe she's realizing intimidation doesn't work on everybody." Meanwhile, the violation letters stopped. Completely. Not one more notice about Cooper. Not one more complaint about my porch paint. Funny how quickly priorities change when lawyers start reviewing old documents. Melissa, however, wasn't finished. 3 days later, I came home to find a contractor parked outside the fence with a skid-steer loader. Melissa stood beside him wearing sunglasses and speaking with absolute confidence. "Remove it," she told him loudly enough for me to hear. The contractor looked at me. "Sir, is this your property?" "It is." "Do you object to me taking down the fence?" "Very much." I handed him copies of the recorded easement while he remained seated in his machine. He spent less than 2 minutes reading before climbing back out. "Ma'am," he said to Melissa, "I'm not touching this." "He's bluffing," she snapped. "Then you remove it." The contractor answered as he climbed into his truck and drove away. I couldn't help smiling. Melissa glared at me. "You think you've won?" "No," I said calmly. "I think paperwork usually wins." By the 5th afternoon, the transformers sounded different. Not dramatically different, just strained, like an engine pulling a trailer that's a little too heavy. Around 6 o'clock, I noticed the faint smell of overheated insulation drifting across the street. I looked toward the enclosure for several seconds, then quietly went back inside. Cooper followed me, completely unconcerned, carrying his favorite tennis ball. About 30 minutes later, the lights flickered once. Then again. A low metallic groan rolled through the neighborhood, followed by a sharp popping sound that echoed between the houses. I stepped back onto the porch just as a shower of bright orange sparks burst from the top of the aging transformer. People began running into the street. Someone screamed. Another homeowner shouted that the power was out. Within seconds, thick gray smoke curled into the evening sky, and then flames erupted from one side of the metal housing. Fire engines arrived astonishingly fast, but the first crew stopped outside the locked enclosure. The captain walked toward me. "Sir," he asked firmly, "are you the property owner?" I nodded once. "Can you provide access?" Without saying another word, I reached into my pocket, pulled out the key, and walked toward the gate. As the lock clicked open, I remember thinking about my grandfather's voice all those years ago telling me never to give away something people would someday pretend had never mattered. The firefighters moved fast once the gate swung open. Thick foam covered the burning transformer while utility crews shut down the remaining lines, but the damage had already been done. One by one, the lights across the subdivision went dark. Garage doors froze halfway open. Pool pumps stopped humming. Electric vehicle chargers went silent. Within half an hour, the Arizona heat began creeping into houses that had been depending on air conditioning all afternoon. People stood outside wiping sweat from their faces, staring at the blackened transformer as if it had betrayed them. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I just leaned against my porch railing with Cooper sitting beside me, watching professionals do the job they'd been prevented from doing for months because nobody had bothered to straighten out the paperwork. The next morning, the utility investigators arrived. They photographed everything, reviewed maintenance records, and asked me to provide copies of the easement documents. By lunchtime, they already understood the timeline. The access agreement had expired. Renewal had never happened. Inspections had been delayed, and the transformer had continued operating through record-breaking temperatures without the scheduled servicing recommended by the manufacturer. None of those facts cared about anybody's opinion. Facts rarely do. 2 days later, Melissa knocked on my door again. But this time I almost didn't recognize her. The expensive SUV was gone, replaced by an older sedan. Her designer sunglasses had disappeared, and for the first time since we'd met, she looked exhausted instead of confident. She stood there quietly for a moment before speaking. "Can we talk?" she asked. I invited her onto the porch. Cooper walked over, sniffed her hand, and lay back down without making a sound. The same dog she declared a neighborhood menace barely acknowledged her existence. Melissa looked at him, then looked away. The insurance company denied the claim, she admitted softly. The board is blaming me. Homeowners are furious. We need permanent access restored. I listened without interrupting. After everything that had happened, yelling would have accomplished nothing. I never wanted your neighborhood to lose power, I finally said. I wanted you to stop treating people like they didn't matter. She lowered her eyes. There wasn't much she could argue with. I went inside, returned with a folder, and placed it on the small table between us. This is a proposed easement agreement, I explained. Long-term access, scheduled inspections, liability protections for both sides, and compensation for the continued use of my family's property. She opened the folder slowly. The numbers reflected fair market value, not revenge. The utility company would regain legal access. Maintenance schedules would be protected. Any future work would require proper notice, and every party involved would finally have clear responsibilities instead of assumptions. Melissa flipped through the pages before letting out a long breath. The board won't like this. Maybe not, I answered. But they'll like another blackout, even less. 48 hours later, every homeowner received an emergency HOA meeting notice. I wasn't invited, but judging from the conversations I overheard afterward, it was anything but pleasant. Residents who had defended Melissa for months suddenly wanted answers about ignored maintenance, expired agreements, and legal threats sent over something as ridiculous as a dog barking twice every morning. By the end of the week, the board voted to approve the agreement. Melissa resigned before the next monthly meeting. A few neighbors later told me she moved away before the end of the year. I honestly hope she found a place where life became a little less about winning arguments and a little more about living alongside other people. A brand new transformer was installed a few weeks later, complete with updated monitoring equipment and a maintenance schedule nobody would ever ignore again. The utility supervisor stopped by after everything was finished and shook my hand. You know, he said, most people would have handled this very differently. I smiled. Maybe, but sometimes the loudest lesson isn't taught by shouting. Sometimes it's taught by letting people experience the consequences of the decisions they insisted were harmless. These days my mornings are quiet again. At exactly 7:15, Cooper still walks onto the porch, stretches those old legs, lets out his two familiar barks toward the passing mail truck, and wanders back inside expecting breakfast like nothing extraordinary ever happened. Every time I hear those two barks, I can't help smiling because they remind me that standing your ground doesn't always require anger. Sometimes all it takes is patience, good records, and the willingness to let the truth speak for itself. Now I'm curious what you think. Did I go too far by enforcing my legal property rights? Or did the HOA create its own disaster by trying to bully the wrong neighbor? If you were in my shoes, would you have unlocked that gate any sooner? Or would you have handled the situation differently? Share your thoughts in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and I'd genuinely like to hear where you stand.